Hey guys, welcome back to the Joy of Wrenching. I'm your friendly neighborhood mechanic, and today we're back on Project Retro Joe. If you don't remember, that's our 1978 C3 Corvette. And today we're going to go through the entire braking system. We've gone through the ignition system, the cooling system, we've got the thing running, and so now it's time to make sure that it'll stop. So we're going to go from front to back. Master cylinder, lines, rotors, calipers, the whole 9 yards. We're going to try and reuse what we can just to save a little money. But if we can't, we're not going to compromise on safety. So we're going to have to replace a few things. But let's see what we can find, what's going on with this car. It's been off the road for about 20 years, so it'll be interesting to see what's still good and what's not. So come along, join me as we get started. Go ahead and look at the different components. Here is caliper on the front. Looks like they're relatively new. I'm definitely going to take these apart and check out the pistons though. It's been a while. Hoses on the front don't look too bad, so we'll probably at least get started with those. But I did want to show you something up back here. See if you can see the problem here. Look at these brake pads. This back one here, it's in correctly. This front one, metal backing plate is against the rotor. So whoever did these brakes put them in backwards. We're gonna have to redo this line here that goes around and then comes back into the caliper. But other than that, we'll just take it apart and see how bad they can be. Here's the rear caliper on the other side. At least they put the brake pads in correctly on this side. It too needs a new hard line coming from the flex hose back here, been leaking. And not sure so much about the rotors, but we're gonna go ahead and at least get it going with these before we decide whether or not they need to be turned or something. Let's look at the front passenger side. Again, looks like a relatively new caliper. At least the pads are in this one correct. And the hose here looks okay, not too dry rotted or cracked. So if you crack the lid on your brake reservoir and it looks like this, dry as a bone, I tell you, you're staring down a brake flush at least, but a lot of times whenever it gets this low and dry, the master cylinder itself seals will be perished as well. So just plan on having to overhaul at least this whole master cylinder. Just step down through the brake system from the master cylinder, follow the lines down, and along the frame rail you'll find a proportioning valve. Typically looks like this, and it's got electrical connector up on top of it. And that's the connector that's going to send a little signal to that dashboard light that says brake. And if your brakes lose pressure, then it will set off that light. And as is shown in this car, it's lit up right now. All right, continuing down the brake system from that proportioning valve, just follow the lines down. They'll attach to the side of the frame rail typically like this. Just follow them along, make sure there's no rusted places in them, they're not pinched or cracked anywhere or leaking. If you follow the brake line, the hard line down the frame rail, eventually you'll get to one of the corners of the vehicle where that hard line is going to transition to one of these flexible lines. So you want to check that transition, make sure that there's not some rust and corrosion there, make sure there's no leaks there, and then also on these hoses, look at them real close for dry rotted cracks. If you see them really cracked and dry, chances are they're going to fail, and it's a good idea to go ahead and replace that before you have a loss of braking power. Okay, continuing down the brake lines, we're down to that flexible line. That flexible line is going to attach to the brake caliper. So just, again, make sure that there's no leaks, no cracks on those brake lines, and that you've got a good seal and no evidence of leaks at the caliper. In this case, these calipers look painted gray, pretty shiny, so we may have gotten lucky with this one and had somebody replace the calipers at some time in the past. But we're going to dig into those calipers a little deeper and make sure that the pistons and the seals and everything are good on those. And so this is following the hard line to the rear of the vehicle. So on the right side is where that hard line transitions to a T connector, and half of the brake fluid will be diverted to each of the left and right rear wheels. And you've got another one of these flexible connection hoses, and so these oftentimes are overlooked because they're kind of tucked up underneath the back of the vehicle and not as visible. These are really perished. You can see some leaks, evidence of leaks here. We're going to go ahead and replace all of this. And here's that flexible rear line on the other side of the vehicle in the back, and it too very dried out and crusty, definitely in need of repair. So those rear flexible lines turn into hard lines, and then those snake around like this and then screw into the rear calipers here. So again, we've got some relatively new looking calipers, but man, these rear brake lines appear to be leaking pretty profusely, so we're going to definitely address that. And here's that hard line on the other rear brake, it too showing evidence of some rusting and definite leaks. Replacing this flexible line from the hard line back here. I need to get one of these little clips to hold that in. Then we'll do a new hard line. Went ahead and just clip this old one off. We'll do a new hard line that goes from this flexible line, comes around to the back of where the caliper is. Caliper looks good. Again, it's a aftermarket caliper or rebuilt. Got aluminum anodized, that's why there's that gold color. Pistons in it, we checked the pistons, everything looked like it was sealing up right. The brake pads, once you spun it around the way it's supposed to go, look like they're still in good shape, so we'll try and run them. It's coming together. Here's the front caliper all put back together, took it apart, again pushed the pistons out, checked the bores, everything looked good. This hose looks nice up here, the lines are good from here, so this one should be ready to go. I don't like the way these rotors look, but at least for test driving, I think we're going to go ahead and make sure that they work, and then we'll worry about turning them or replacing the rotors.
That's it. I have had it. I am done trying to make these parts work. Every time I turn around, the thing is leaking, the thing won't seal, the thing won't bleed. And I went and I looked it up, and a new caliper, remanufactured caliper for this thing, is only about $65. So I'm at the point where, I have rebuilt these brakes a couple of times. It just makes more sense to get one that's already been remanufactured and refreshed internally as well. So that's the way I'm headed. I'm going to get some new rotors while we're at it, new brake pads. We're going to make this right because, again, safety is the most important thing. And so let's get into it. Let's make it right.
Here's a master cylinder. Had real hard time getting it to push fluid around. Found out that the seals inside were all dried out. So time to replace it. And again, these are not very expensive parts, and it's really a good idea when in doubt to go ahead and start with something fresh. It's real easy to replace this. It's got these two bolts you can see sticking off of the booster there. You just take the nuts off of it. I show both of the nuts here in these two pictures, and undo the lines to it. Put the new line, or put the new master cylinder in place after you bleed it, of course. So there's a whole process for that, but hook it all back up and you're good to go. Carrying on down line from the master cylinder, we run into the proportioning valve. The original proportioning valve on this car was stuck in the failed position, which is what happens. It'll move to the failed position whenever it loses pressure, either to the front brakes or the back brakes, because it had lost that at some point. It had moved over, but then seized itself over the years in that position. So a lot of times, if it just recently happened that it moved to the failed position, you can kind of move it back to the center position, but this one was unsalvageable. So replacement again, and the replacement ones come all brass. I think the original ones are a little bit steel, but these are good parts. They're really not that expensive. You can get them all online. Just unbolt the old ones. The hardest thing is going to be, breaking all of these old lines loose and not rounding over the nuts where they screw in. But just take your time, and worst case scenario, use some vice grips. So the flex lines that were headed to the front brakes looked okay from the outside. They weren't too dry rotted. There weren't a whole lot of cracks. They seemed to be flexible still, but I couldn't get the front brakes to bleed. And I was just, dumbfounded by that. And so I decided, okay, where is the restriction? So I just took apart different connections until brake fluid was running out. And so I found that brake fluid was running out where the hard line tied into this flex line. So that told me that there was a constriction somewhere in that flex line. Took the flex line off and looked inside the end of it, and this is what I saw. It was completely clogged up with rust. So somehow that water inside the brake fluid over time had created some rust that inside of a rubber line completely clogged the inside. So again, time to replace these. So I took apart all the calipers and rebuilt them with new seals and put it all back together. I checked inside of these piston bores and I could see this rough surface, this little bit of pitting, but I thought, maybe it will seal after all. Well, don't fall for that trick. Learn from my mistake here. Any kind of pitting inside of that bore, especially when it gets as bad as is shown in this picture here, it will not allow for the sealing of the little rubber seal there that I'm showing. And it'll tear them. The old ones were torn. This is an old one, but it'll tear them. It'll cause a leak, and so I never could get these calipers to stop leaking after I rebuilt them. So ended up just going and looking online, and sure enough, a new caliper, or let me call it a remanufactured caliper, was only like $65. And so I had already tried to rebuild these things a couple of times, and it's kind of a fiddly process to rebuild them. So just save yourself some time and headaches, and just get you the remanufactured ones. They're not that expensive. And again, safety is the most important thing. So here's the pile of new parts. I'm not condoning it, but I just wanted to show you that your local parts store will have these things, even for these old vintage cars. And they're not that expensive, so don't neglect to go and look there. In order to get this brake rotor off of this hub assembly, we got to remove these rivets here. So we're going to drill those out. You want to get a starting point to start your drill right in the center of these things. So go ahead and get you a center punch and put a dimple right in the center of these rivets, all the way around. That's just a place for that drill bit to start biting, and then it'll go right down through the center. And the metal that these rivets are made out of is relatively soft steel. You want to get you a titanium bit. Those seem to work best, but they are kind of brittle, so just be careful not to push too hard on it. And you want to set that thing right in the center of your little divot that you started. And sometimes it's a good idea to get a little bit of lubricant there too. Set that bit right in that divot and get it going. You see how easy this stuff drills out? Look at that. We got a pretty good size hole going there now. You can just continue down a little bit. Not too. Puppies are going crazy. You don't have to go too far. Maybe a quarter, a little more than an eighth of an inch. And then we'll go to the next one. Once you've got a small hole drilled down the center of these things, step up to a larger bit, something, not quite as big around as the rivet, but maybe 3/4 the size of that rivet. And just go through it until that head of that rivet pops off like that. And then move on to the next one. You can clean up your shavings here, or leave it for later. So now that we've got those rivet heads off, let's go ahead and I'll show you what's going to be down. Show you what's left here. Okay, so here's your rotor free. Now look, we've got these little chunks of these rivets still sticking up through the through the hub there, and we need to knock those out. And so you can either try to grind it off or whatever, but probably one of the easier ways is to just drive them out the back. So set this thing back into place. Set that hub back in there, and let's put a couple of lug nuts in place here to hold the two together now, since the rivets aren't going to do it anymore. And we want to grab a punch and drive the center of that rivet down through what's left of it anyway, down through the hub. Just like that. See, it knocks it completely through. I'll show you on the back side here. So that's what it knocked out. And it was right in there. So that's out of the way. Now we got a few more of those suckers to bang out of there. But that's how you separate them and get the mess out of the way so that you can put your new rotor on your existing hub. Okay, so now we've got all of those rivets driven out. We can separate these two again for good. See how it just falls out of the way there? Push that thing through there. Might have to give it a little love tap to get out of the way. But now we have a nice flat surface for our new rotor to mate against here on the existing wheel hub. So now we have our hub assembly free of its old rotor. We can go ahead and slide that onto the spindle there where it came from, and we can put it back in place by returning its bearing and then washer. And that washer has a little notch or whatever, a little doohickey that goes at the 12 o'clock position, has to slide in this groove on the spindle. So you like that. And then you take your castellated nut with the castles facing outward, and you want to go ahead and spin that back on. Bottom it out. And again, these things should turn very easily by hand. If it doesn't, that means that the threads are boogered up, or maybe there's a bunch of dirt mixed in with the axle grease here. So you might want to clean that up. I'm just doing this for demonstration purposes, where I would also be cleaning this up quite a bit. All right, now get my hands cleaned up a little bit. Now you want to tighten that nut a little bit, not too terribly tight. You want to spin this while you do that, and you want to feel, does it have any play in it? And once the play is gone and it's not tight but snug down, you want to line up the hole that this cotter pin goes into so that you can replace the cotter pin. You definitely don't want to forget these things, and it's also a good idea to replace it if it's fatigued. Now, the cotter pin hole on this one happens to be right here at this angle, so I'm going to stick that thing back through there if I can. There we go, right back down in there. And you want to make sure that you take this end and bend it so that it can't come back out. Now, take your protective dust cap, set it in place, get your hammer or something, and tap that thing back flush. Now, you can take your new brake rotor and put that on, just like so. That's how we get new brake rotors on our old hubs on a C3 Corvette. Now this is what it's supposed to look like. This is the all new parts, or newly remanufactured parts anyway. We got good brand new flex lines. We know they're open. We've got new calipers with no pitting inside the bores, good seals, got new pads and new rotors. And as I showed you, getting those old rotors off and putting the new rotors on isn't too hard, but it does take some steps. And this should work way better. I mean, it was so easy to bleed this system. I mean, just after I put all this stuff together, leave the bleeder screws open for a little bit and gravity will bleed it. So such a difference in what I was dealing with before. So highly recommend going this route, and hope this helps you a lot.
Okay, so we figured it all out, didn't we? We found that unfortunately most of the parts were not reusable on this thing. You know, it'd been off the road for about 20 years, and you know, brake fluid absorbs a lot of water, and that water is going to make things rust. It's going to cause some pitting, as we saw inside the piston bores. It's going to ruin some of the lines, as we saw. So just make sure that you check for those things really carefully. You know, I was surprised that the parts were not that expensive, the remanufactured parts. So, you know, you're going to have to make a judgment call sometimes. Is it worth your time to try to rebuild something, make it work? Or can you just get another one that's already been remanufactured? And that's what I found was most cost effective in this case. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this, learned a lot. I know I did. And if it was helpful to you, if you're enjoying this sort of thing, please hit that subscribe button. I really appreciate it. It helps us to reach a greater audience. And I also appreciate you taking the time to watch us today. So thank you again. Y'all have a wonderful day, and God bless.